CreepyPasta, the mirror that showed me tomorrow. I found it at a garage sale last summer, in one of those sleepy little towns you only pass through on your way to somewhere else. I had been aimlessly driving, letting my mind wander as the miles ticked by, when I saw the sign, estate sale, everything must go. The words struck me as oddly urgent, and without thinking, I turned onto the gravel driveway, my car crunching over the stones as I approached a large, creaking house. The place had the air of something abandoned, peeling paint, shutters hanging by a single hinge, and a lawn overgrown with weeds. A handful of people were milling about, picking through boxes of knickknacks, old furniture, and dusty books. It didn't take long for me to realize that this wasn't just any estate sale. It felt like a purge, a desperate attempt to rid the house of its contents as quickly as possible. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but something about the scene drew me in. I wandered through the items, picking up a few things here and there, before my eyes landed on the mirror. It was tall, probably close to 6 feet, with an ornate gilded frame that hinted at a long-forgotten elegance. The gold leaf had faded and chipped over time, giving it a worn but still dignified appearance. Despite the dust and age, the glass itself was clear, almost unnervingly so, reflecting my image back at me with perfect clarity. An elderly woman, who I assumed was the owner, noticed me staring at it. She hobbled over, her cane tapping on the ground with each step. "You like it?" she asked, her voice raspy from what I guessed was a lifetime of smoking. "It's an old family piece. Been in the house for generations." I nodded, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the mirror. "It's beautiful. How much?" The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she were appraising me rather than the mirror. After a moment, she sighed. $5. Take it off my hands, please." I was taken aback by the low price, but I didn't argue. I pulled out a crumpled $5 bill from my pocket, handed it to her. And before I knew it, the mirror was mine. The woman helped me load it into my car, her hands trembling slightly as she let go of the frame. As I was about to leave, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Her grip was cold, almost clammy, and her eyes bore into mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Be careful with that mirror," she said in a low voice, almost a whisper. It's not just a mirror. It shows things." I frowned, unsure of what she meant. "Shows things?" She nodded slowly, her expression grave. "It shows tomorrow. What will happen? But don't trust what you see. The mirror doesn't lie, but it twists the truth. Be careful." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and thanked her, though her warning lingered in my mind as I drove home. It was a strange thing to say, but I brushed it off as the ramblings of an old woman. I'd heard of people attributing all sorts of strange qualities to antiques, but I wasn't superstitious. When I got home, I lugged the mirror into my apartment, placing it in the hallway just outside my bedroom. It was heavy, and I struggled to position it just right, finally angling it so that it reflected the doorway to my room. I admired the way it fit into the space, giving the narrow hallway a sense of depth that hadn't been there before. That first night, I noticed something odd. As I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of the mirror in the reflection of the bathroom mirror. I paused, my toothbrush hanging from my mouth, as I noticed that the reflection in the hallway mirror didn't quite match the reality around me. The small things were off: a book on the floor that I hadn't dropped, a cup on my bedside table that was knocked over even though I'd left it upright. I frowned, spat into the sink, and went to investigate. But when I stepped into the hallway and looked directly into the mirror, everything seemed normal. The book was on the shelf where I'd left it, the cup was standing as it should. Shaking my head, I chalked it up to my imagination and went to bed. The next day, though, the mirror's strange behavior lingered in my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to put it to the test. That night, before bed, I purposefully arranged my room in a way that I could easily verify the next morning. I left a pen on the floor, tilted a picture frame slightly, and placed my phone on the far edge of the nightstand. When I looked into the mirror that night, I felt a chill run down my spine. The pen was gone, the picture frame was perfectly straight, and my phone was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the cup I had left untouched the night before was now on the floor, lying on its side as if it had been knocked over. I went to bed with a sense of unease, but I forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I nearly jumped out of bed to check the room. Everything was exactly as the mirror had shown. My pen was missing, the picture frame was straight, and the cup was lying on the floor. My phone had fallen off the nightstand and was under the bed, exactly where I hadn't placed it. The realization sent a wave of dread through me. The mirror wasn't just reflecting reality, It was showing me something else, something that hadn't happened yet. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe I had subconsciously moved things during the night, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Over the next few days, the mirror's strange visions became more disturbing. It started with small, seemingly innocuous details: a book moved, a light left on. But then it escalated. One night, I saw the front door of my apartment wide open, despite knowing I had locked it before going to bed. The next morning, sure enough, I found the door slightly ajar. The deadbolt turned as if someone had unlocked it from the inside. I became paranoid, double and triple checking everything before bed, but it didn't matter. The mirror continued to show things that hadn't happened yet, and every time, they came true. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The more I stared into that mirror, the more I felt like it was staring back at me, watching, waiting for something. Then, one night, everything changed. I had been on edge all day, dreading what the mirror might show me that night. When I finally worked up the nerve to look into it, my heart skipped a beat. There I was, standing in the reflection, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. The figure in the mirror was me, but it wasn't me. The eyes were hollow, dark, like they had seen things that should never be seen. They stared back at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I couldn't move, couldn't look away, as the reflection began to change. The figure in the mirror took a step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. It reached out a hand, pressing it against the glass, as if trying to push through to the other side. Then, it smiled, a cruel, twisted grin that sent a wave of nausea through me. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair as I did. The noise snapped me out of my trance, and I tore my eyes away from the mirror, heart pounding in my chest. But the image was burned into my mind, the hollow eyes, the twisted smile. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept the mirror covered with a blanket, but I could feel it, the weight of its gaze pressing down on me. In the early hours of the morning, I heard a noise, a soft whispering sound coming from under the blanket. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the sound grew louder, more insistent. When I finally worked up the courage to pull the blanket back, I was met with a sight that made my blood run cold. The reflection was gone. The mirror showed only my room, just as it was, but something was different. There, on the floor in front of the mirror, was an old, faded piece of paper that I hadn't put there. It was yellowed with age, and the edges were frayed as if it had been handled many times. Scrawled across the paper in messy, desperate handwriting was a single word: run. Panic set in. I grabbed the paper, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't think straight. The mirror had shown me things before, things that always came true, and now it was telling me to run. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw on some clothes, grabbed my keys, and bolted out of the apartment, not caring about anything else. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cool night air hitting me like a splash of water. I fumbled with my phone, trying to call someone, anyone, but my hands were shaking too much to dial. I don't know how long I stood there, gasping for breath, my mind racing with the horror of what had just happened. My thoughts were jumbled, torn between the desire to flee and the urge to make sense of what the mirror had shown me. But one thing was clear: I needed to get away, and fast. Without thinking, I jumped into my car, hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped away from my apartment, not caring where I was headed, just as long as it was far from that mirror. As I drove through the dark, empty streets, my mind kept replaying the image of the hollow-eyed figure in the mirror. What was it? Why had it appeared? The old woman's warning echoed in my head: it shows tomorrow. But don't trust what you see. What did that mean? Had the reflection been a twisted version of me, or was it something else entirely, something that had taken my form to deliver that message? Eventually, I found myself at a small, 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered as I parked and stumbled inside, my legs feeling weak and unsteady. I must have looked like a mess because the waitress behind the counter eyed me with concern as I sat down. "Are you all right, honey?" she asked, her voice soft and motherly. I nodded, but I could feel my hands still shaking as I tried to steady my breath. "Just a rough night," I mumbled, not sure how else to explain what had happened. She brought me a cup of coffee, which I sipped slowly, trying to calm my nerves. The warmth of the cup seeped into my hands, grounding me a little, but my mind was still racing. I needed to figure out what to do next. I couldn't go back to the apartment, not with that mirror still there. After a few minutes, I pulled out my phone and started searching for information about the mirror. I hadn't thought to do it before, but now I was desperate for answers. I tried to remember the details the old woman had mentioned, but there wasn't much to go on. All I had was a vague warning and the terrifying experience I had just lived through. As I scrolled through forums and articles, I came across a few stories that sounded eerily similar to mine. People talking about mirrors that showed things that hadn't happened yet, or mirrors that seemed to have a life of their own. Most of the stories ended badly, people driven mad by what they saw, or worse, disappearing without a trace after the mirror showed them something terrible. One post, in particular, caught my eye. It was from a user who claimed to be an antique dealer, specializing in items with unusual properties. He wrote about a mirror that had passed through his hands years ago, a mirror that seemed to foretell the future in twisted, nightmarish ways. The description matched my mirror almost perfectly, the gilded frame, the unsettling clarity of the glass. But what really grabbed my attention was what he said about how to break the mirror's curse. The mirror thrives on fear and uncertainty. It shows you your future, but it twists it, making you doubt what is real and what is not. The only way to break free is to confront it head on. Face what it shows you, and reject it. Don't let it control your actions. If you can do that, the mirror will lose its power. I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of dread and resolve. Confront it? How was I supposed to do that when just looking into the mirror filled me with terror? But what choice did I have? If I didn't do something, the mirror's influence would keep growing, and who knew what it would show me next? I sat there for a long time, trying to muster the courage to go back. It wasn't easy. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that cursed mirror as possible. But deep down, I knew that running wouldn't solve anything. The mirror would find a way to haunt me no matter where I went. Eventually, I forced myself to stand up, leaving a crumpled bill on the counter to cover my coffee. The waitress gave me a worried look as I walked out, but I didn't have the energy to explain. I just nodded at her and stepped back into the night. The drive back to my apartment felt like a death march. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands were clammy on the steering wheel. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the hollow-eyed figure sitting in the back seat. But there was nothing there, just the dark, empty road stretching out behind me. When I finally pulled up to my building, the sight of the familiar facade filled me with a deep sense of dread. The building was silent, almost oppressively so, as if it were holding its breath. I sat in the car for a few minutes, gathering my courage, before finally forcing myself to step out. The hallway leading to my apartment felt longer than usual, the shadows stretching out ominously. My footsteps echoed in the silence, each one feeling like a countdown to something terrible. When I reached my door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The memory of the reflection's twisted grin flashed in my mind, making me want to turn and run again. But I couldn't. Not this time. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The apartment was just as I had left it, dark, quiet, and suffocating. The blanket was still draped over the mirror, but I could feel its presence like a weight in the room. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the covered mirror, feeling a mix of fear and determination welling up inside me. Finally, with a trembling hand, I pulled the blanket off. The mirror's surface was dark, almost black, reflecting the room in a distorted, shadowy way. For a moment, I thought nothing would happen, that maybe the mirror had lost its power. But then, slowly, an image began to take shape in the glass. It was me, standing in the same spot, but something was wrong. My reflection was smiling, that same twisted grin I had seen before. But this time, the hollow eyes were gone, replaced by something even more terrifying, my own eyes, but filled with a deep, dark rage. The reflection stared back at me, its smile widening as if it knew something I didn't. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet its gaze. This was it, the moment of confrontation. The reflection wanted me to fear it, to give in to the terror it was trying to instill in me. But I couldn't let it win. "You're not real," I said, my voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. "You're just a reflection. You don't control me." The reflection's smile faltered for a moment, its eyes narrowing as if it was taken aback. But then it returned, wider and more sinister than before. The figure in the mirror took a step forward, pressing its hands against the glass as if trying to break through. I clenched my fists, every muscle in my body tense with fear, but I held my ground. "You don't control me," I repeated, louder this time. "You're just a mirror. You don't control my future." The reflection's eyes flared with anger, its movements growing more frantic as it pushed against the glass, trying to reach me. But I didn't back down. I stared it down, my resolve hardening with each passing second. And then, something incredible happened. The glass of the mirror began to crack, tiny fissures spreading out from where the reflection's hands were pressed against it. The reflection's grin twisted into a snarl as it banged against the glass, but the cracks only grew larger, spider webbing across the entire surface. With one final push, the mirror shattered, the glass exploding outward in a shower of glittering shards. I stumbled back, shielding my face as the pieces rained down around me, the sound echoing through the apartment like the breaking of a curse. When I finally dared to look up, the mirror was gone, nothing but a broken frame and a pile of shattered glass on the floor. The reflection, the twisted figure that had haunted me, was gone. I stood there, breathing heavily, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. It was over. The mirror was gone, its power broken. The sense of relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But as I surveyed the damage, my eyes fell on something among the shards of glass. A piece of paper, old and yellowed, just like the one I had found before. My heart skipped a beat as I bent down to pick it up, dreading what it might say. This time, the message was different. Scrawled in the same messy handwriting were 3 words that sent a chill down my spine. "You're not done." I stared at the paper, my mind reeling. What did it mean? Had I really broken the curse, or was this just the beginning of something even worse? I didn't have the answer, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let that mirror, or whatever force was behind it, control my life any longer. I threw the paper into the trash, grabbed my keys, and walked out of the apartment, not bothering to look back. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed to get away from this place, to start over somewhere new. As I drove away from the apartment, the city lights blurred into streaks against the night, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The mirror was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces, but the message on that old, yellowed paper haunted me. "You're not done." Those words echoed in my mind as I navigated the empty streets. What did it mean? Was the mirror only the beginning? And if so, what was coming next? I found myself heading toward the outskirts of town, away from the familiar streets and into the unknown. My only thought was to get as far away from that apartment, and that mirror, as possible. I drove for hours, not really caring where I ended up. I just needed to keep moving, to put distance between myself and whatever dark force had been unleashed. Eventually, I pulled into a small, roadside motel, its neon sign flickering ominously in the darkness. I was exhausted, my nerves frayed to the breaking point, and all I wanted was a few hours of sleep, a brief escape from the nightmare that had taken over my life. I checked in with the night clerk, a disinterested man who barely glanced up from his TV as he handed me the key. The room was small and musty, the kind of place that had seen better days, but I didn't care. I locked the door behind me, threw my bag onto the bed, and collapsed onto the thin mattress, the events of the night finally catching up to me. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, but exhaustion eventually took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. But sleep didn't bring the peace I had hoped for. Instead, I found myself trapped in a dark, oppressive dream. I was standing in an endless hallway lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a distorted, twisted version of myself. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel something watching me, lurking just out of sight. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing eerily in the silence, each mirror showing a different version of me, some with hollow eyes, others with cruel, mocking grins. I tried to look away, but the reflections seemed to pull me in, each one more unsettling than the last. At the end of the hallway, I saw it, the same mirror from my apartment, its gilded frame gleaming in the dim light. But the glass was cracked, spider-webbed with fissures, just as it had been when I shattered it. As I approached, the reflection in the mirror came into focus. It was me, but this time there was no smile, no hollow eyes. Instead, the reflection looked terrified, eyes wide with fear. It pressed its hands against the glass, as if trying to warn me, to reach out and stop me from approaching. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but something compelled me to move closer. The reflection's fear was palpable, and as I got closer, I realized why. Behind the reflection, in the depths of the mirror, I could see something moving, shadows swirling, taking shape, forming into something monstrous. The reflection opened its mouth, as if trying to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows behind it grew darker, more defined, until they formed a figure, a tall, looming presence that radiated malice. The figure's eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and as it stepped closer to the reflection, I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I wanted to run, to wake up, to escape this nightmare, but I was frozen in place, unable to look away. The shadowy figure reached out, its hand passing through the reflection and pushing against the glass, just as my own reflection had done before. But this time, the glass didn't crack. Instead, it rippled, like water disturbed by a stone, and the figure began to push through, emerging from the mirror, its eyes locked onto mine. In that moment, I knew what the message on the paper had meant. The mirror was only the beginning. Whatever this thing was, it had been waiting, biding its time, and now it was free. With a jolt, I woke up, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I was drenched in sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The motel room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering neon sign outside the window. For a moment, I was disoriented, unsure if I was still dreaming or if I had truly woken up. But as I sat up, trying to calm myself, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the small table beside the bed, was a piece of paper, yellowed and frayed, just like the others. With trembling hands, I picked it up, dreading what I would see. The words scrawled across the paper were different this time, but they filled me with the same cold fear. "It's coming for you." I dropped the paper, my mind reeling. The mirror was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces, but whatever dark force had been tied to it was still out there. And now, it was coming for me. I didn't know what to do, where to go, or how to escape. But one thing was clear, the nightmare was far from over. The mirror had been just the beginning, and now I was caught in a game I didn't understand, hunted by something I couldn't see. I grabbed my bag, threw the door open, and ran out into the night, the paper crumpled in my fist. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there, not with that thing on my trail. As I drove away from the motel, the words on the paper echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the horror that awaited me. "It's coming for you." And as the dark road stretched out before me, I knew that no matter how far I ran, no matter where I tried to hide, it was only a matter of time before it found me. And when it did, I wasn't sure I'd survive to see another tomorrow.